listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barber-Gap with you. Welcome to this episode of The Briefing. There are landmark days in the news cycle, ones that go down in history. The Queen dying, a Prime Minister being ousted in a party room revolt, the September 11 attacks. These are days when you know you're watching history unfold before you. And that's how it felt today when we heard former US President Donald Trump was found guilty on 34 charges relating to paying off a porn star. So to recap, Trump had sex with Stormy Daniels at a Lake Tahoe hotel room in 2006. News of the affair emerged in the lead up to the 2016 election, and Trump, through his then lawyer Michael Cohen, paid Daniels $130,000, that's just shy of 200,000 Australian, to kill off the story. Trump then had to repay Cohen, and he did so in a series of payments that were disguised as being for legal advice. Prosecutors in New York investigated claims Trump had falsified his reports and therefore influenced the outcome of the 2016 election. The lead prosecutor, Alvin Bragg, brought the charges against Trump, the first time a US president or former president has ever faced criminal charges. After around 11 hours of deliberation by the jury, the panel of 7 men and 5 women determined that Trump was guilty on all 34 counts. So with that all said, the burning question remains, what happens next? Well, to find out, I'm joined by Associate Professor David Smith from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. David, thank you so much for joining us today. This feels like a significant moment in history. Would you agree with that?
It is. This is the first time that either a current or former US president has been convicted of a crime. So it is very significant.
Were you surprised by the verdict this morning?
Legal analysts thought that this was the weakest case of all of the ones that Trump is facing. It was very complicated. It involved a novel legal theory that the district attorney was using. And certainly I struggled at times to be able to explain what it was that they were trying to prove. But I wasn't in the courtroom, and it does appear that the prosecution made their case very effectively to the jurors. One of the things that made this outcome unsurprising was that it was visible even from here that Trump was really undermining his own cause. He was going outside the courtroom every day and abusing the judge and witnesses and even casting suspicion on the jurors. His lawyers seemed really hamstrung by Trump's campaign strategy. They really had to claim at all times that Trump had done everything perfectly. Their defense seemed to be based mainly on character attacks on witnesses. And some legal analysts are saying that it was basically Trump's defense that blew it, that this should have been winnable for them, but they blew it.
Yeah. So the jury deliberated for about 11 hours, and the debate we had here in the studio was, what does that mean? Before we got the verdict, we're like, is that good? Is that bad for Trump? What do you make of the fact that they spent 11 hours and came to a guilty verdict on all 34 charges? Does it indicate that they felt confident in that guilty verdict?
I think it does. I'm seeing this described as a quick verdict. Certainly by people who observe the New York court system, they say that this is relatively quick for a jury verdict. The things that the jury was asking to have read back to them seem to indicate that they were taking the prosecution's case very seriously. And there were 34 charges here, and on all of them, they were guilty, which means that they were unanimous. So this does seem like a fairly confident verdict.
So sentencing is set down for July 11, and the question on everyone's lips is, will he go to jail? What are the chances?
I think that it would be politically and logistically fraught to send him to jail. We have to remember that under American law, Trump, as a former president, is entitled to Secret Service protection for the rest of his life. That includes if he goes to prison. Any prison would have to be able to accommodate that pretty large Secret Service detail, which means I think that it would be a lot more prudent for a judge to opt for either home detention if he wants to incarcerate him, or a non-detention penalty like community service or fines or probation or something like that. I find it very hard to see him actually ending up inside the walls of a prison.
Do we have a precedent for similar convictions and sentences of charges like this? I mean, you said the options are potentially home detention or community service. Like, what have we seen in the past with similar cases?
Well, the legal community seems to be suggesting that as a first-time non-violent offender, Trump wouldn't probably be subject to the maximum penalties in this, which are 4 years prison. This is a white-collar crime case. It is an important case because it's to do with business integrity, falsifying business records in the aid of electoral fraud. It is serious, but it's not the sort of thing that people would usually imagine would get someone sent to jail. There's no actual precedent because of the novelty of the case that the prosecution made. This is actually the first time that someone has been prosecuted in exactly this way, falsifying business records in the service of electoral fraud. So there's no actual precedent for a sentence here, but certainly most observers seem to think that it'll be on the lighter end.
Okay. Look, we talk about this case in particular, but we've got to remember there are 3 other indictments that Trump is facing and are yet to be heard. How will they impact the 2024 presidential race?
It seems increasingly likely that the other 3 won't happen before the election. So the case about Trump's involvement in January 6th, that is currently awaiting the Supreme Court to deliver its decision on whether Trump had immunity for his actions. That seems quite likely to go back down to a lower court. Even if the Supreme Court says that Trump doesn't have immunity, this will have delayed it so far that it's unlikely it will happen before November. The documents case, which is being heard in Florida, the judge there is hearing a lot of procedural back and forth, which also seems to be delaying that case. So this, in all likelihood, is actually the last time we'll see Trump in court, or the sentencing will be the last time we see Trump in court before the election. Of course, Trump is also likely to appeal this verdict, but that, again, is unlikely to be heard before the election.
Yeah, right. So it's something that's going to continue to play out. It feels like we got an answer, but kind of not really based on what you're telling us. Look, let's talk about his voter base. Now, there's talk about how this could negatively affect people voting for him, but there's a question around whether this could actually increase support from his base because it feeds into, this conspiracy narrative that the establishment is trying to sabotage him. Where do you lie on that issue? Do you think this will increase his voter support or maybe lower it?
It's pretty hard to say. I don't think it will increase his number of votes. It may make his supporters even more devoted to him than they were before, but they were going to vote for him anyway. There was a recent Reuters Ipsos poll that suggested that something like 10% of Republicans said they would reconsider their vote for Trump if there was a guilty verdict, but only 4% said that they would change their vote. Now, that 4% could be, it doesn't sound like much, but it could be significant in a race where the national polls are currently showing the margins between Biden and Trump at 1 or 2%. In Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, very similar, very slim margins. So even a small number of people turning away from Trump could actually hurt him in this election. But then again, these polls were conducted before the verdict. Now that the verdict is actually out there and people are going to be hearing all kinds of political spin, people might change their views. Republicans who previously said they wouldn't vote for Trump if he was convicted, they might have been saying that because they didn't expect him to be convicted. So it's very hard to say what impact this will have. I certainly don't think it will increase his vote, but it might not decrease it by very much either.
Okay. On the flip side, President Joe Biden will also be watched closely in the wake of this decision. He posted on X this morning that the only way to keep Trump out of the White House is via the ballot box. That's the only reaction we've had at this point. How important is Biden's response to this guilty verdict and then the sentencing in his hopes of being re-elected?
So Biden and his campaign have tried to stay aloof from all of this. They haven't always stayed aloof, but they've tried. That message from Biden this morning shows that he clearly thinks that this verdict is certainly not going to sink Trump, that the campaign is still going to go on. Trump is still leading in the polls at the moment, and Biden knows that he has to win back voters. And he's telling his base, we can't rely on a legal verdict to knock Trump out of the race. It's just not going to. This could potentially help Biden a little bit, but he still has a lot of work to do. The kinds of younger voters and minority voters who seem to be turning away from Democrats at the moment, they might not be affected very much by this verdict at all. So Biden still has a lot of work to do.
Look, quickly before we let you go, Trump rolled out his usual talking points after the verdict this morning. It was rigged. This is Biden's fault, throwing immigrants in there for some reason, as he is wont to do. How do you think he's feeling, and will this give him a bit of a reinvigoration as he really ramps up campaigning, or is this going to be a hit to his confidence?
Looking at him this morning, he actually looked a lot less invigorated than he usually is after he comes out of court. He said basically the same things, but he said it in a much more glum, downcast kind of way. The reality is that a loss is a loss. And however much bravado he puts on it, however much his allies say that this is actually going to help him because the American people will see how unjust it is, he is now a convicted felon. And that's not something that any candidate, even Trump, would want attached to them. Trump portrays this aura of invincibility. Every time he actually has a really tangible defeat, that visibly does shake his confidence a little bit. So it doesn't look like he's feeling great at the moment.
Yeah, well, still 6 months to go till we head, well, not us, but till they in the US
Yes.
head to the polls. We've still got a little while left till our federal election, luckily. But thank you so much for breaking it down and helping us understand better what the next 6 months will look like. David, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
That was Associate Professor David Smith from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. And that is all for this episode. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share it with someone you think might enjoy it. And don't forget, we are back tomorrow with the weekend briefing. Antoinette, who have you got coming up for us?
Hey, it's Antoinette Lattouf. This week, I chat to Eliza Hull for the weekend briefing. She's a musician, an author, a disability advocate who does incredible work raising awareness or giving tools to parents on how to discuss disability with their children. And in recent months, she's been turning her disability advocacy to Gaza.
Sounds great. Thanks, Ant. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sasha Barbagat. We'll see you next time.